Lovely. So we're going to make an official start. So good morning and welcome everyone. It is lovely, really lovely to have you all join us for part 2 of our beginner to business series of the CCRAF 2026 edition. So it's lovely to have all of you join us. Last week, we would have looked at starting a small hydroponic system with Sherry-Ann from Antigua and Barbuda. And we had such an exciting session, very good conversation, and we're looking to have the same today. And so with that, just a little housekeeping for those who came in now. So you are muted for security purposes to prevent any sort of breaches with the Zoom, since we are not the ones able to deal with some of the security features of Zoom. And so for that reason, we have muted everyone. So once we reach the discussion session, I will unmute you once you raise your hand, and towards the end, towards the close, I will unmute everyone. So, you know, some persons could say hi and so on. The sessions will be recorded and we will be uploading it right after to our YouTube channel. We'll be making the PowerPoint available to you via email first, after which we'll upload to our repository, so it will be accessible to you. Feel free to turn on your cameras if you're in an area where it's suitable to turn on your camera. Please be careful, especially with the phones, that you don't accidentally turn on your camera and you're not in a suitable position for sharing your screen, your video. Okay, so I know we may have a lot of new people on. So basically, the idea of the CCRAF, last year we celebrated 10 years, and that came about where persons wanted a bit more of a formal, structured platform or network in terms of accessing agriculture information, agriculture knowledge that is relevant to the region. And so within ECA space, the CCRAF was born. And so we are now going into our 11th year of operation. We have made quite a number of changes. We have included quite a number of other initiatives. And so our key objectives are to share the knowledge within the agriculture sector, resilient practices, as it relates to the agricultural sector. Of course, for us to move forward, we need to do things together. We may not always be on the same page, but doing it together in any case helps us to reach the goal a bit more effectively. And of course, collaboration is needed also for that. And very important, while we share the knowledge, for us to meet the needs of the people, for us to address the challenges within the sector, we need to act. And so one of our key objectives is translating the knowledge to action, and that is where, to build upon that, we would have launched what we call the CCRAF on the road, where we go into the countries on the ground, collaborate with partners, existing projects, stakeholders, where we can implement and have you be part of those direct action on the ground, stemming from some of the discussions through the webinars, some of the requests directly from the ministries of agriculture, and through some of the existing projects. And so as we move along, we do have a number of platforms. So as I mentioned during the beginning, so you don't always have to wait for my email for you to see what is happening with the CCRAF. So I'll just give you a quick before we go into the session. So we do have a website. So you could go through, you could see a lot of the upcoming events. So you don't necessarily have to wait for the email. I know some persons' inboxes are full. That tends to happen when you have your photos synced to Google Photos. So maybe you want to unsync that so you could get some space for your emails. So you can go directly to our website. You could see and you could access our content from since 2021. We also have our YouTube channel where you can access all the videos, from since 2021. As soon as the session is done, I download and I upload to YouTube, so you can access it there. in terms of accessing also the PowerPoint, while I send it via email for continuous access to it, you could head into our AgriProfiles repository. And so you will see a lot of the sessions we have done. And so you could get in there and you could access a lot of the PowerPoints and various documentation. Okay. And then we have our Facebook, we have our LinkedIn, and we have our Twitter. So you can just go directly to those pages to access that. So with that now, that takes us to our session today. And so we will be looking at starting a small vermicompost enterprise. I know we've done sessions on composting, composting some of the waste from your kitchen, composting within your farm. And so today we're looking at more specifically vermicomposting, and Michael will be presenting on that today. He has a lot of experience. He'll let you know how he went, what made him become interested in it, how he went from a beginner and now operating a business as it relates to vermicomposting, also including trainings, capacity building within that area. And so with that, so you can open up your screen now because I am going to launch a poll. I'm going to launch a poll on the screen. I'll stop sharing to allow Micah to set up his PowerPoint, and I'm going to share a baseline poll on the screen. So just open up your screen. When it pop up, please do not close it because I'll not be able to send it to you personally. So I'm launching it now. Just open your screen. Oh, sorry. Wrong one. It's a baseline. Voila. So it's just 3 questions. So you could just answer those while we allow Micah to share. Micah will say a little about himself, and then he will head into the presentation on vermicomposting. Again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. And we will take questions within the chat, and you could raise your hand during the discussion session. Micah, over to you. You ready, Micah?
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nikelia. And just want to make sure that my screen is on and you hear me clearly.
Yes, I could hear you and your screen is shared. If anybody have any difficulties, please do so in the chat.
Right. Okay, so good morning again. And let me say thanks to the ICA and the CCRAF team for this opportunity to share with you today on vermicomposting. I have been involved in the practice of composting, I would say, for a little over 10 years now. And the business side of it is a bit more recent. I would say within the last 5 years, I really put a lot more effort into monetizing it and organizing it as a business. So today I'll be really sharing with you my experience. I will include some of the technical knowledge here because we are operating within a time frame. So I'll do as best to balance it for you in terms of the technical as well as my experience. So the structure of the presentation will be, we look at what you need basically to get started. We will look at the earthworms environment, how to identify them, selecting the right species. We look at food and how the earthworms interact with them, testing your product, what you could look for, what you could do. And we'll also look at some of the business opportunities that from, I would say, a structure of the industry standpoint. So what do you need to really get into vermicomposting? It's important that you understand what you are getting into. So some background research will definitely help so that you understand the organisms that you are going to work with, right? And that will ensure that you do not fail at this venture. You need a receptacle, a container in which you could make your worm castings. And what you would have normally considered to be your waste is now food for another organism, the earthworms. And you would need somewhere that you could make your worm castings that is comfortable for both you and the earthworm. So the presentation will really be centered around these key points, so to speak, and how you could work them to your advantage. Sharing this one. Right. All right, I think I will turn off my video a little bit just so that the internet will move a little more smooth, and I'll reopen it in the discussion. Good. So as far as vermiculture, vermicomposting is concerned, there are slight differences, right? Sometimes we use the terms interchangeably, but they don't necessarily mean the same thing. So if you are doing vermiculture, if you are into the culturing of worms, most times you are doing it to supply or to service some need in the market, right? So persons are constantly looking for worms to make vermicompost. There are persons who are looking for worms to feed maybe their pets or to go fishing. Earthworms are generally almost complete source of protein. So persons who try to do it, grow their animals as natural as possible, like chickens and so on, fish, they are seeking worms for that purpose, right? In very limited situations, earthworms are a source of food, right? So some tribes, different parts of the world, consume earthworms as a source of protein. Vermicomposting, on the other hand, that practice really focuses on using worms to recycle organic waste. And as a result, you will find that the management of these two methods is slightly different. At the end of each process, you will get castings, and it goes by a variety of names, you know, for market purposes. They call it black gold, worm poop, all of these fancy names. What you get at the end of the process is worm castings or vermicast, right? In the system, you have earthworms at different stages of development. So you will have the adult worms and you'll have the juvenile worms. The adult worms are differentiated by the presence of a clitellum, and we'll look at that a little closer as we move into the presentation. Right. You also should become familiar with the decomposition process. There are some basic factors that would really drive the breakdown of organic waste or control the breakdown of organic waste. And depending on how you manage these factors, you could either be doing hot composting or you could be doing vermicomposting. And by managing these factors, you would really be creating conditions that are favorable for different type of decomposers. So when the hot composting takes place, for example, it's mainly controlled by microorganism activity. However, as it cools down, you'll find different types of microorganisms coming in, entering the pile and contributing to the curing or the stabilization of the organic waste. Where vermicomposting is concerned, we want to have control over temperature because we know that will naturally kill the worms, right? So it all depends on how well you manage these variables. And while you are doing it, if something does go wrong, it's largely as a result of one of these factors not being considered, not being managed properly. So from a knowledge standpoint, it's important to understand the decomposition process. What are the factors that influence the breakdown of organic waste, and how you could create conditions that would really favor the worms as well as microbial activity. Now, it's important now that we understand the worms. What kind of worms would be working with, how you could identify them. Most persons are familiar with the red wiggler, and it is one of the most researched species as far as the worm industry, vermicomposting is concerned. And because of that, a lot of the information out there is largely biased to the red wiggler. And because of that now, we sort of have a challenge of getting vermicomposting going in the region. And that is where my research really came in, where I try to identify whatever species we have available locally and their suitability for vermicomposting. So that essentially is where my quest started and where the interest and the business started to grow from there. So on the left, we have the red wiggler, which is a temperate species. It's adapted to low temperatures, the cool environment. And on the right, we have the Eugilus eugeniae, the African nightcrawler. We have the Perionyx excavatus. Both are tropical species. So during my search for the suitable earthworms, I came across these two species. And the literature would have already established that these species are being used in different parts of the world, particularly in our tropical environment, for recycling organic waste. In addition to that, we also came across other species that we could use for vermicomposting. And we have here what I term or call the UE blue, Dicogaster annie, right? And we also discovered Homodeus collex divergens, right? Therefore, it tells us that beyond the two known tropical species that we have, which would be the African nightcrawler and the India blue, that we have other species that we could consider for vermicomposting. And sometimes persons would ask, well, what about the worms in the soil? Can they use them? Right? So what we have here is more or less a checklist that you could use against the species that you find, and you will determine whether they are suitable for vermicomposting or not. In your search for worms, I would say the first place you want to look is areas where you have high levels of organic matter. So once it occurs that you have to dig the soil, there's a high chance you are not looking for species that are suitable for vermicomposting, right? The worm that you are looking for, they spend most of the time on the soil surface in areas where you have high levels of organic matter. So take, for example, a livestock pen, you know, particularly like maybe cattle, rabbit, these type of animals, where you have your manure piles. This would be the typical place that you would have seen those worms, or you would see them. And the question therefore is whether they are suitable for vermicomposting. Because within that group, you would find a lot of worms maybe close to the manure. They might be feeding, some might be feeding on the soil or a mix of the soil and manure. Some are feeding on the manure purely. So you want to ensure that you would be collecting the right species, even if you find it inside of the manure. So one of the first things you want to do is collect some of these worms, particularly if you find them in the manure. And you could have a receptacle, a small container, where you could start to test them. culture them to see how suitable they are for vermicomposting. So the characteristics that you would essentially be looking for is a wide tolerance to different types of organic waste. So whether it is household waste, farm waste, to a lesser extent, some of the commercial waste that you would find maybe from stores like card boxes, this type of paper material, all of this can be recycled by earthworms. So you would want to feed them those materials. And if they show an interest or they demonstrate that they can break down these organic waste, it tells you that you have a potential species on your hand. From there, you would want to know how well it converts the organic material. So earthworms generally would consume about half their body weight on a daily basis, and that is rotting waste. And you'd want to see when you feed them maybe a specific amount of waste, how quickly that would break down. Because it's possible to get a worm that shows a lot of interest in, I would say, different types of organic waste, but the rate at which it breaks down these materials would be relatively slow. So you also want to look at conversion, how quickly that happens. Once that checks off, you can look at the reproduction. So you may be getting a high conversion rate as far as the organic waste is concerned, but you would want to know also how well do they reproduce under those conditions. We being fed those different types of organic waste. So the reproductive rate of these worms comes into question when you feed them different types of materials. They may react differently, and you would want to know how well that takes place. Within a 3-month time frame, the worm would have reproduced. You would have eggs, then you would have juveniles, and you would want to see how well that develops. From there, you would want to know the conditions for which you have created for these worms, how well they are tolerating it. So you took them out of their natural environment, somewhere where you had maybe a lot of manure, a lot of leaves, grass, something like that. And now you put that in a container where their movement is a bit restricted, right? And various things will be happening there while the waste is breaking down. You could have fluctuations in pH. You could have a buildup of soluble salts under those conditions. And you would want to know whether these worms can actually tolerate those conditions. Additionally, these worms must be easy to handle. There are some worms that you will find in organic waste, and they generally do not like to be handled. So in the wild, so to speak, when you get them out there in that natural environment, they would show, they'll be very reactive to touch. So when you handle them, you'd find that they would want to escape from you. Over time, once you have them culturing them under controlled conditions, you would realize that they become a bit more tolerant to you interacting with them. So the worms now that you would have been culturing there, you would want to make sure that over time, they could tolerate you interacting with the material, you feeding them, you handling them, observing them, and not necessarily looking to escape at any opportunity out of the system, right? So you can find worms out there that are inorganic waste, feeding on organic waste, but whether they could meet these characteristics is something that you would need to investigate, right? And from what we saw with the additional 2 species that I indicated, right, it tells us that there may be other species out there that have not been reported. It tells us that they could be cultured and we could add to our stock instead of importing earthworms, right? Now, The life cycle of the earthworm is quite simple, right? They are hermaphrodites, and therefore, whenever they interact or they mate, right, each worm would be impregnated. After that, they would form a cyst or a cocoon that they would release from the head portion. So the image on the left, if you could see the cursor, you would see this little band here. This is the clitella, and that will be observed mainly on your adult worms. These are the worms that would be responsible for procreating in the system. Now, once fertilization has taken place, they will release these eggs into the system. Initially, it would have a sort of egg white color, and over time, it will assume the color of the material, which is generally brown to dark brown in the system. That would take roughly a week and for that to take place. And from there, for different species, it will vary as far as incubation is concerned, right? So within a 2-week time frame, these eggs will start hatching. For different species, the Eugellus eugeniae, some reason the rest of the title, the species name didn't show up, but where you see the E there, that would be our Eugellus eugeniae, and that would take roughly 14 days for the eggs to hatch. The number of juveniles you would get from there would be between 2 to 3, and it would take roughly 50 days for these juveniles to now become sexually mature, meaning that they would have developed a clitellum by that time. You will notice that it's similar as far as the number of juveniles for the Icena fetida. However, you'll get slight variations in the incubation time and the time to sexual maturity, right? But the vermicomposting process, the cycle of vermicomposting is centered around this, the life cycle of the worm. So that normally takes a 3-month time frame for you to start harvesting castings. If you do try to extract castings before that, you could be affecting your next generation. So sometimes, the excitement is there that we go in and we start to remove castings from the system, but you'll be removing eggs and juveniles in the process. Now, so as far as vermicompost production is concerned, is quite simple, where, you just prepare the food and you feed the worms, you harvest your castings. But it's important for us to appreciate what really goes on in the system, how that affects the worms, and how the worms actually affect the organic waste. One of the first things we should appreciate is that earthworms will consume rotten waste or highly decomposed organic waste. So if it is you put vegetable scraps and so on in your system, they would wait for that to start breaking down before they could feed on it. So you do have situations sometimes where persons may feed their system, but the worms would not be able to access the food until it starts breaking down. So as far as you are concerned, you may have fed your system, but your worms could be starving, right? So it's important to appreciate that the waste must be decomposed, not highly decomposed, for them to start feeding on it. You'll also appreciate that the digestive system of the worm is similar to that of chickens or birds, right? So one, there is no teeth. They would be basically sucking in the decomposed material. And as it goes through the gut system or the digestive system, you have calciferous glands that will help to regulate the pH of that food waste. As a result, it would be making the conditions more favorable for beneficial microbes to start feeding on those organic waste, and by so doing help with the breakdown and the nutrient release. So we can appreciate, therefore, that it's a relationship between earthworms and microbes, a beneficial, a symbiotic relationship. From there, it goes to the crop and it moves on to the gizzard, where it is grounded up much finer and moves through the earthworm's intestine. So let us look at food and how the environment affects the worms, right? So at the time of figuring out these worms and how to manage them, interest grew into the technology. And one of the things I did was to create a kit that persons could get pre-started and move straight into feeding those worms their organic waste, right? So that would have been basically a worm bin with worms and so on. It would have started about 2 weeks in advance. And what I added to that was some knowledge. So I did training as well with that. So when you leave, you would leave well informed and you'd be able to manage your system going forward, right? But as far as design is concerned, this is just a starter. It could be considered a seed startup, and you could decide where and how you want to improve on your design. So there are persons, you know, they had their containers around the home and they decided they want to convert it into a worm bin. This blue barrel is something you'll typically find around a lot of homes. So if you want to repurpose container, you know, you could use the blue barrels, you could use refrigerators, these old refrigerators that you would have been getting rid of, bath pans, some kind of basin, if you want to keep the cost down. I also went ahead and designed larger bins for persons who wanted to try and do it on a larger scale or try and go sort of semi-commercial, right? So these are things that if you have, you know, some little bit of carpentry skills or geometry, as far as, you know, how to cut and put a square or a rectangle together, you could design a system for yourself. But this system, I built it with a sifter built into the cover, so that by the time you finish, you get to the point of harvesting, you have a sifter right there that you could start screening the material. So one of the things you have to appreciate about your design is that you must mimic the conditions from which you got your worms. And I like to tell people, just think about the soil environment, and you would basically design your worm farm around that. Your whole system must reflect where the worms came from. And some of the variables you really want to pay attention to would be temperature. The soil is generally cool, so you want to make sure that the conditions inside it always remain cool. The soil is dark, and you want to control the amount of light in the system. The soil is damp, right? And so you want to maintain your moisture inside it, because moisture and air, they tend to compete for the same space. So you could either have a system where the bin is waterlogged, or sometimes it's too dry. So you want to just strike that balance where the worms are comfortable and you are not promoting anaerobic conditions. Additionally, your system must now control the effect of predators or competitors on your earthworms. Because in a natural environment, other organisms would have been feeding on the organic waste along with the earthworms. And therefore, it means that there is some sharing of food resource taking place, and that in itself can have a controlling effect on the earthworm population out there. in addition to which predators or opportunists would have used that environment to start feeding honeyworms as a source of food, a source of protein. So your design should ensure that you have control over that so that you could see your stock grow rather than being controlled by organisms that would normally feed on worms or organisms that would compete with your worms for food. Earthworms will consume a wide variety of organic waste. So, household waste from your receipts, your envelopes, your vegetable scraps, your cardboard packaging, all of these things they will consume. Even some of the coconut shells and so that will generate, once you get these materials at an advanced stage of degradation, they will consume all of that. Farm waste, they will eat most of the organic waste that we generate on farms. Where livestock are concerned, poultry litter, that is something that just because of the high salt content can be, it would be something that they would not find favorable, right? You'd have different, I've seen different results out there with persons who would have tried poultry litter, but I would generally discourage it if you're not very familiar with managing these type of organic waste, right? But most of your ruminant manure, they will consume it, right? The leaf litter, the vegetable scraps, all of these things, after you harvest the leaves and so on that remains, all of these different types of organic waste, they will consume. But you must appreciate that it must be at an advanced stage of breakdown. One of the things you want to do is really characterize those organic materials. So the materials that would tend to break down very quickly, they would have a low fiber content, and therefore we consider them to be our green materials. They will rot quickly, your cabbage, waste, all of these soft materials, they tend to rot quickly in the field. And so they would generally fall into the area of our green or brown, our more fibrous materials. They show more resistance to degradation. And so these materials would comprise our brown materials. From the home, the same like the cardboard, shredded paper, all of these things would form your brown material as compared to your vegetable scraps after you finish cooking and so on. That would comprise your green material. What you really want to avoid, particularly from the home, I would say, is like cooked food waste and so on, as that could encourage a bin to go rancid and encourage flies and other unwanted organisms inside it. But earthworms will generally consume a wide variety of organic waste, but you can characterize them based on their properties. The waste materials that are generally bulky, you could refine them, you could cut them up smaller, and that will induce decomposition. All organic materials would have pH, whether it's near neutral, which you could typically find with your some of your brown materials like cardboard, paper, all of these things. Some of the food waste, they will be on the acidic side, and all of that can affect the way worms interact with organic waste. Salinity, or the EC, the electrical conductivity, that is something you would typically, an issue I would say you typically find with manures. So these materials, you may need to leach them before you feed them to the worms, and that could be simply maybe soaking it in water, or you create some kind of strainer where you just run some water over it, and that will reduce the salt content inside it. Bioactive compounds. That can be an issue, particularly with plant material. So if we look at a lot of the food we eat, these plants would typically have compounds in them that would sort of inhibit feeding, right? We know that there are a lot of pests out there that would feed on some of your plants. And so plants develop that, or they have that natural mechanism where they would sort of create these compounds where they might be bitter, it might be sticky, and that would sort of control organisms that would want to feed on them. If you take these materials and you feed it to the worms, sometimes you could get responses that are not favorable. So if you look at something, a typical material, like let's say maybe dashing, we know that we would have to cook dashing, for example, because it has this compound in it that causes itching, right? And when we cook it, that could actually change our response. It make our response more favorable. And so in that sense now, some of these organic wastes out there, you would have to take them through a process where it breaks down to some extent, where the microbes would sort of reduce that negative effect that the worms, or negative response that the worms would have had to those wastes. And as a result, you would get a more favorable response where the breakdown of these wastes is concerned. So some plants, they do have compounds in them that the earthworms may find unfavorable. And that is something that you should consider where feeding them is concerned. Where it has to do with feeding the worms, earlier I mentioned that the worms will consume roughly half of their body mass per day, right? And that refers to rotten waste. Now, the way we generate our waste, that may not be entirely practical for us. So as I said, if you have it breaking down, then that would make it more favorable for the worms as far as consumption is concerned. What you have to appreciate, however, a lot of these wastes, moisture makes up a large proportion of their mass, right? So it's easier if it is you feed the worms by volume rather than try and figure out what the dry mass of these materials is. And that's just looking at it from a very practical standpoint, because you can go technical if you want and get an oven and dry it out to try and figure out what is the dry matter content. And from there, you would know, well, based on this mass, this is how much the worms are actually getting. But to keep it simple, I encourage people to go by a volume basis. And what that does, if you were to feed, let's say, roughly a gallon volume container, and you come back, let's say, after about a week, you can assess, therefore, what volume or what the actual volume of that material was consumed. And all of this is just looking at it by sight, right? So you would have fed them, you come back, this maybe 50%, 80% of the material is consumed. And that's a very simple, practical way to go about feeding your worms rather than focusing too much on a mass for mass basis. So to make the vermicomposting process simple, one of the things I did, and I do currently, is really just take the waste through a composting process. So all of the issues that are regarding pH and bioactive compounds and so on, you could basically control that or amend that through composting. So whether you have a small container, whether it's a tub, or you have some space in your backyard where you could put some pallets together, you could gather your organic waste. Generally, you want to have your brown materials at least 3 times more than the green, and you take that through a hot process. That is just one simple way of simplifying the way you treat with organic waste, and at the same time, you integrate the strength of either system to make vermicompost. So the heat can contribute or help with the sterilization of seeds and other pathogens that might be weed seeds, that might be in a system that you may not necessarily have full control over under the practice of vermicomposting. But if you were to take it through a composting process, the heat can help you reduce some of these negative issues that are associated with the organic waste. And from there, that cooked material, you can take it to feed your worms. That material would be at an advanced stage of decomposition. So when you feed it to the worms, it makes it much more simple, right? You would have simplified your feeding and the way you manage your organic waste. Now, once you would have managed or I would say brought under control any issue regarding, how you treat with your waste, create the right environment for the worms to thrive. What you want to do going forward is really pay attention to how well your system is doing. And the earthworms, they are naturally, or they are recognized as environmental indicators. So by just taking a look at the worm, it could give you an idea of whether you are doing good or you may need to adjust something to make conditions more favorable, right? So you look at the worm. Here, we can see the clitellum present, right? That simply gives you an indication that the worms are breeding, they are thriving well in the system. In the absence of the clitellum, it may indicate that maybe the food source is not sufficient. Maybe there's something wrong with the food, right? That they are not eating it, and therefore they are not committing the energies or the resources towards multiplication. Your moisture, for example, could be limiting. And as a result, the body of the worm could take on a sort of leathery appearance. And that is something you can adjust easily. So earlier I mentioned the different variables that you could manage. And by just looking at the worm, you will know which one could be off. If you go through the system and maybe you notice that your numbers might be dropping, it could be that you have a predator inside it, right? The food, everything else might be good, but you may have a flatworm or a centipede, something inside there feeding on your worm. So it's important to really pay attention to the system, but you can start off with the worm. The body of the worm could give you a good indication of how well the system is doing. Additionally, you, over time, that is an acquired experience, I would say, to put it that way. You will observe eggs in your system, right? So once you are managing your system well, the presence of eggs, cocoons in your system, they are a good indicator that your system is growing, that the conditions are well, and you can experience a jump, so to speak, in your population, right? A huge increase in your population. If you are not seeing that, again, you might not be managing something properly in your system. Now, as it says, the system advances, you will observe that the material that you fed initially, right, it has transformed. So it no longer looks bulky. The appearance tends to look more grainy, right? And that is an indication that your worm farm or your vermicompost system is reaching a stage where it is ready to harvest. Right, this is not plain. Right, so there are some little indicators I would say that you could pay attention to determine whether you are on the right track, right? You could be feeding the worms, but you're not seeing casting production. And that is something, again, it reflects on how you manage or the type of food that you are feeding them. Your worms, if they are not multiplying, these are all indicators that you may not be doing something right. So these are just some of the things you could pay attention to as far as manage the system is concerned. Once you would have gotten that under control, and you are at the point of producing castings, you'd want to know how well or how well the castings perform, how well this product that you are creating, it performs on plants, right? That's essentially what you would be producing it for. So for me, I started trying it on vegetable crops, root crops, and the results have been very promising. So if it's something that you are looking to get into, before you look to sell, what you want to do is test it for yourself, see how well it performs, and through that, you could develop measurements. So if you want to tell somebody to use maybe a cup of castings or a teaspoon, maybe for seedling production or for leafy crops, you would only figure that out by testing the product. Once you are satisfied with the results that you are getting, then you could move forward and do more detailed testing and look at your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium content, any other minerals inside there that might be of interest to you. But one of the things you want to appreciate with compost generally, compared to what we call synthetic fertilizers, you would find much lower values, right? So it should not, your expectations, that should sort of limit your expectations, so to speak, right? Sometimes, it's promoted as a very high value product, but you must always, or you should always remember or keep in mind that you are dealing with organic waste. You are recycling organic waste. And therefore, there's a limit to the amount of nutrients that you would typically find inside it. Where manures and so on are concerned, they will raise your nutrient profile inside there. You will get higher NPK values, right? So it means you could experiment with different types of organic waste to get different types of outcome as far as the way the compost performs, right? But just taking that initial initiative and experiment with it on you for yourself on your own crops will give you greater confidence in terms of what you're creating, what you have created before you choose to put it on the market. You can try it with some of the different maybe organic products out there. Again, if you would like to make recommendations based on maybe some existing commercial product on the market where you could tell people, well, if you use it with this product, this is how much you could use, right? Here in the image, for example, well, on the left, we have yellow yam, which the results were quite good using it. And on the right, we have cucumber where the castings was used in conjunction with composting, and the production was really excellent. So it's a product that it can work on its own. You could also use it along with other organic products if you want to go the organic route. You could use it along with other synthetic products if that is not a problem for you. If you want to use maybe fertilizers and so on, you can use the castings with that. But it's just important that, if you are developing a product, that you would go ahead and test it. You could compare it with the use of the castings by itself. You could compare it with the castings and other organic products out there. And so you will see when the castings was present, you got this result, and where it was absent, you got this result. So you can do these little simple comparative studies to really test your product. Now, the industry is quite small, I would say still, but it's growing. So my experience of doing it in Trinidad, I would have gotten a lot of people started and introduced them to the vermicomposting technology. And most persons, they went into it to become self-sufficient. A small group of persons would have decided that they would like to take it a little further by increasing its availability on the market. So I would say from this Trinidad perspective, there are several producers supplying the market with worm castings, and there's an ever-growing demand for it. So for the rest of the region that is now trying to get into it, there are opportunities where just supplying is concerned, right? But let's just take a look at what the structure of the industry could look like. Now, like any other livestock, somebody must be supplying it. So where the industry is concerned, there is that opportunity to supply worms, right, for various reasons. And from there, persons would use the worms to make worm castings, and that has direct agronomic benefits. If we look at the fertilizer market, we have periodic issues with supply, right? And some of these supply issues are related to some of the challenges that are going on globally, right? So countries may withhold their resources to serve their own domestic needs. So you can go into vermicomposting or worm casting production to really help address the issue with supply in the market. You would also observe that fertilizers out there, they are blended to serve different growing needs of the plant. Now, compost worm castings on a whole, they add more to the soil than a regular synthetic fertilizer would. But it also gives you the opportunity to blend organic materials in such a way that they may serve best for maybe root development, where you have root crops, if you're into root crops, or maybe for leafy development, right? So beyond just producing worm castings for bulk production, you could actually focus your efforts on creating something that would target specific plants or specific areas of the plants. The marijuana industry is something that is growing in the region. We are pushing for, greater control in terms of developing the industry. And from my experience, a lot of the persons who are doing it, they are looking for something that is organic. They're not interested in the synthetic fertilizers out there. So there is that opportunity to create worm casting specific to the needs of those persons. So yeah, you can go into its production, but you also have the opportunity to diversify where quality is concerned. From there, you could take that raw material and create different types of growing media out there. We are still heavily reliant on peat moss, these type of peat moss based products for our seedling production. Worm casting generally superior to these materials as it offers itself as a media, but also as a nutrient-rich media that you get a win on both ends, so to speak, that you could produce seedlings at a lower cost by just producing worm castings, right? Or you can dilute it, you could mix it, which is one of the better approaches to go with these materials so that our dependence on the peat moss-based products could slowly reduce, right? So whether you dilute it maybe at 30%, it means that it's 30% less peat-based products that you would have to use to grow your plants, particularly seedlings. And you could develop different soil amendments out there. Some people, based on the experience of vermicompost production, they may not feel that this is something that they cut out for. They may not have been successful at it, but there's also the opportunity to take the product and add value with it by mixing it with other materials to create different type of soil amendments. From the livestock perspective, Cuba is one of the better examples of how earthworms have been used as a substitute for animal protein by converting it into a flour, right? So there's that opportunity as far as what we could do with the worms. And some persons, they rather source the worms from someone, who is reliable, that they could take the worms to go and do fishing rather than be digging up the environment out there. So we can actually just reduce our environmental impact in that sense by making the worm available for persons who are into fishing or they have pets. It reduces that labor or laborious part of going out there and searching for worms, right? By just having it available. In other parts of the world, some of the extracts from worms and so on, they are used as antibiotics, or they are explored for their antibiotic properties. So that might be a little far-fetched for us, but it tells us that there is an opportunity where that is concerned. Now, once you become familiar now with what you need to get started, right? You could move forward with a little more confidence now that you are more aware of what you need to get into vermicomposting, the type of worms that are best suited, where you could find them, right? So like I said, for example, once you find yourself having to dig the soil, that already is a sign that you're not looking in the right place. So you typically want to find areas where you have high levels of organic matter on the soil surface, right? Whether it's leaves, grass, manure, these are the typical places that you will find them. In addition to which, you want to recreate the conditions that would be necessary or suitable for their survival, right? So your container must reflect that. And your food, the food that you feed them, is now organic waste that you would have redirected, right, to better use. So rather than it ending up in a landfill or improperly disposed of, the worms would offer you that benefit of converting the organic waste into a biofertilizer. Compared to the regular compost, it's a material that when it's finished, it's ready to use, right? It doesn't necessarily have to go through that curing period. In fact, if you just out of excitement while it's being produced, you take some and you put it around your plants, you can always be guaranteed that you wouldn't have no soil-borne pathogens going to affect your plant, nor you will see any negative effect on your plant. It is ready to use when it's finished. And the worms basically produce that on a daily basis. So you could actively commit to repurposing your organic waste to something more useful. All in all, your operating space, right, will depend on how big you want to go. So if you're starting off small, it could be maybe somewhere in your veranda. It could be on a shed. If it is, you just want to set up a small operation. Most important, just make sure it's conducive for you and the worm. Sometimes, you know, we will do the vermicomposting in a container, and then when we are looking to harvest, that's the time we're looking to lift that container onto a higher level to try and extract the worms from it. That could lead to, you know, discomfort to the back. So it's important to make sure that that level of comfort is associated with your design, with your plan. As we move forward, I want to share with you a book that you could get, you know, if you have that level of interest in vermiculture, vermicomposting, right? It's one of the most comprehensive books out there as far as the technology is concerned. And very little is mentioned about the region. In fact, most of the report speaks on what is going on in Cuba, right? And so it would be nice that, you know, we get to a point where the industry grows to the extent that, you know, we could insert a chapter for CARICOM as far as reporting on the development of vermicomposting globally, right? So I hope that, you know, this brief sharing would have just sort of opened up our thinking on the technology. There really wasn't that much time for like going to fine details, but I hope that it opened up your thinking in terms of getting into it. Some of the things you could pay attention to as far as vermicomposting is concerned. And I will take it back to the chair now. If you have any questions, and hopefully we can have a discussion on it.
Okay. Excellent, lovely. Thank you so much, Micah. I know it's quite a lot of information. I see a lot of people are quite interested in terms of the vermicomposting, you know, bio, eco, going that route is very important to persons right now. Cutting down cost, really, really important lately. And so I want to thank you so much, Micah, for this in-depth presentation that you have done. I know we cannot cover everything at this point, but we will take some of the questions, some of the experiences of persons that are probably currently undertaking the vermicomposting. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat, although we would prefer if you could raise your hand so we can, you know, hear the various voices and the faces. So with that, I see Yinka, you have your hand up. So I will allow you to unmute yourself. Go ahead, Yinka. You should get a notification. Just click on the notification to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to know if you don't want to have to go digging outside to look for the earthworms, what's an easier way to get started?
Good. All right, you hearing me there?
Yes, we could hear you, Micah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you have, as based on what you asked, you know, you have the option to go and search for the worms yourself, or you could buy it, right? That is your other option as far as sourcing the worms is concerned. Importing it does come with its challenges, right? Most countries have very strict criteria on importing exotic species because of the risk of, you know, them maybe spreading in the environment, and then you don't have much control over their spread. And sometimes they may adapt and spread much quicker than your native species, right? So I would say that's your other option in terms of sourcing it. You would have to buy it from a source. Just to add, from my perspective, I think I would just like to say that my work on it is more from the vermiculture standpoint, because I've spent a lot of time just trying to get persons started, because the industry will only grow once we have a lot more players in it, right? It shouldn't necessarily be a limited few doing it. So that has been my contribution in terms of making worms available, culturing them and selling compost systems so that persons can take it from there. Some persons are actually selling based on how they grew their system. So you have that opportunity as well.
So are you saying that it's better to use the native worm that I might find versus purchasing?
Thank you. Right. So yes, I'm suggesting that you use your native worms that are more adapted to your local
Environment.
conditions, right?
Okay.
As far as acclimatization is concerned, less work there, right? Once you get it into that container and they show that they have settled, then that's where you really need to go. Putting the option out there for persons as well that if you find worms and you're not too sure where they are, right? You can always email an image or photo to me, and I can give you feedback on whether you have found one or not, right? But like I say, once you have to break the soil and they start to move very slow and they look like pale in color, you are not looking for vermicomposting worms. Vermicomposting worms, they tend to be very agile and vibrant, dark pigment, right? So these are some of the giveaways as far as searching for them.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for your question. We have quite a number of persons to take, a lot of questions to take. So let's just keep the responses succinct and the questions to the point, persons. Micah, the book, where can people find them?
Amazon.
Okay, so the book, you could find it on Amazon. Very simple to find. So we will take Lambert, and then I'll also take some questions from the chat after Lambert. So Lambert, I'm going to ask you to unmute, just select and go ahead.
Are you hearing me? Good day.
Yes, we are hearing you clearly. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Martin, for a very comprehensive presentation. My little question is, in terms of the food for the worms, the earthworms, how do we manage the brown versus the green material? Is there any specific ratio that we should be using?
Thank you for your question. Right. So yes, it's similar to what we would do for the hot composting. Right. So your brown materials are a typical good start would be something like cardboard, or the egg paper crates, that sort of recycled paper. All of these things you could use. The toilet paper rolls, all of these would be good brown materials. Now you want to ensure that it's at least maybe 2, 3, 4 times more than the vegetable scraps or the manure that you would be feeding. And it's quite simple to set up. So these materials that I mentioned, for example, like the cardboard and so on, you would want to soak that for at least a day to make sure that, it's properly soaked. You get the fibers inside there to start loosening up, squeeze out the extra water from those materials, and you loosely pack it into your worm bin, and you add your veggie scraps on top of that.
All right. So thank you. You're saying so the ratio should be like 3 to 1, 4 to 1, brown to green.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, colleagues, I see Natasha's hand up. Natasha, you could go ahead. We'll take a question in the chat. Go ahead, Natasha.
Sorry, I was reading with my mic muted. Sorry. Yeah. So I will just take something in the chat and then we'll go to Natasha. What is the best way to control excessive heat in the compost and how to get the worms to reproduce faster?
Okay, thank you for your question. Right, so if you have a heat problem, it could reflect that or it is reflecting that you have a volume issue with your container. So sometimes if the container is more deep than it's wide, right, it would cause the material to pack in such a way that that stimulated microbial activity could contribute to the bin getting a little warm. So it's always good to try and go with a more broader surface area than something steep. It could also reflect that the way you combine your materials, your green materials might be a little too close to your brown inside it, right? These materials naturally break down faster. And if you have, let's say like a one-to-one type of mix inside there, and in addition to the volume of material you put in, that increased microbial activity could cause your system to start getting a little bit warm, right? So you have to keep in mind those things. Persons sometimes also add like oats and cornmeal, as a way of trying to stimulate the worms and stimulate rapid reproduction. That in itself could cause the system to get hot pretty fast, right? Because it will be almost like you're adding sugar to the system. So it's important that, you don't really experiment with these things. They're not necessary. What you want to do, as the discussion raised earlier in terms of your ratio, just ensure that there is enough brown materials, accessible brown materials, your cardboard and so on inside there, and that will be sufficient for your population to start growing. If it is mainly or biased to the green materials, you might get some nice, fat, healthy looking, juicy worms, but it doesn't necessarily translate into increased numbers. So you have to make sure that the carbon inside there is sufficient, so to speak.
Okay. Thank you, Micah. So we will take Natasha now. Go ahead,
Hi,
Natasha.
Micah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a very comprehensive discussion. Can you explain the pre-composting steps that you use for hot compost? Because I do hot compost, and my hot compost always has oxygen flow, but I noticed in your images you had yours in bags.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I heard you clearly. You're asking to explain the pre-composting process, and you notice, you observe, I didn't get the observation you were saying that you...
But I noticed that the pictures you showed had yours in bags, black
Right.
bags, whereas the hot composting I do always has oxygen flow.
Right. So thank you for your question. Right. So where the pallets is concerned, right, I would line the pallets with construction plastic on the sides. At the base of the pile, you would have like PVC pipes with perforations in them to encourage airflow into the pile, right? As it heats up and that heat escape, it naturally encourages cool air to come into the pile. So it's just like creating a nostril under the pile. The plastic is there to protect the compost material from the wood because it would naturally break down the pallet and shorten the extended use of it, right? It maintains as well a high level of humidity inside there, right? Therefore, controlling your moisture, which would stimulate rapid reproduction, but not to the extent that the pile becomes waterlogged or it suffocates or it starves of oxygen, right? So in the other container, the smaller container where the thermometer was present, that is basically a tote, like a 27-gallon tote that I would make my recipe, put it inside there. And it's simple 3-to-1. So like with the vegetable scraps, plantain peels, all of these things, you just cut them up and you mix them inside there with cardboard or these type of materials. And in so doing, because of the amount of moisture in those materials, I tend to limit the amount of water, if any, I would have added to the system, because as it starts to break down, right, you'll have some moisture being generated, and that's sufficient for it to break down. On top of it, what you notice that look like a bag is basically saran netting. So it encourages it to breathe, but it also prevents it from drying out quickly. You will notice at the base of the bin, there was a PVC pipe extended that encourages air to enter from the base of the bin as well, right? But as far as the process is concerned, you would have used your normal mixing of your brown and your greens, like try and keep it at least 3-to-1. And from there, you would pile it into the system and it would start breaking down. What is different is that I would not allow it to go for the extended time in terms of curing. So let's say after about 3 weeks of turning and the material starts to get soft, a bit unrecognizable, mushy, you could start feeding it to the worms from there. And you leave the rest there, you just aerate it, and over time you just feed it and they will eat it up. So the normal time where you might find yourself maybe waiting over 4 months and going, trying to get some good quality compost. If you have enough worms, that container you saw there, that is like 1 meal. So it will have shortened the time significantly.
Excellent. Of course,
Thank you.
Micah do trainings and so on, and you can always reach out to him. He will probably share his information with you, or I could do that in the follow-up email. So while we continue, I know persons have to leave. I'm going to launch the feedback poll on your screen. Please do not close it. If you close it, I will not be able to send it to you individually. And then we will take Craig. So Craig, I'm going to ask you to unmute and you could unmute yourself. So the feedback poll is on the screen. So just take a few seconds to fill it up. Go ahead, Craig.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. As my title suggests, I'm involved with apiculture and CARICOM. And today my purpose was to really kind of broaden my understanding of what soil and worm and composting could value the apiculture industry here across CARICOM. So I guess the call to action is, I guess you guys had an agenda for this call, but I would like to encourage follow-up. We had over, I think, 300 people on the call, which is terrific. But if there are folks that are actually looking for potential initiatives or business models, we're working with a number of different groups. Again, our focus is really on apiculture, but even something as important as compost and worm development is an important part of that value chain. So it's really more of a comment. But again, I think, as in my case, and probably many of the viewers on the call, Micah, again, thank you so much. Very informative. But my question or comment is like, what's the next step? How would you like to turn this into an ongoing consultancy or project if in fact that's something you're considering? So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that contribution, Craig, and thank you so much for joining us today. In terms of that, you want to add any response, Micah, and then I could speak.
Right. So thank you, Craig, for your comment as well. What's next? So far, I would say I would have started it in Trinidad. There was some interest, curiosity about vermicomposting prior to this research being started, and since then, it has grown significantly, where a lot of people are interested in doing it for themselves. And from a business standpoint, that is the gap that I am seeking to fill, to get more persons into it, to service that part of the industry. And for the rest of the region, that is what I'm interested in doing in terms of trying to get countries to have that sort of incubator system where you have somewhere a repository for worms and, as well as training, and the rest of the country can come there, access the worms, and particularly your tropical, your domestic species, you know, so that in the event that somebody, you know, they come there and they see this one, they say, hey, but I have this in my yard, man. So I think I can go and try it for myself. That is what I would really like to see, that we become more familiar with it, but to get countries up to that standpoint.
Thank you so much. So I have my colleague who we co-implement and manage the CCRAF. From ICA's standpoint, I will allow Chani your little support there as I'm working in the background on everything to speak in terms of ICA's standpoint there and also ask your question. Go ahead, Chani. You could unmute yourself.
Yeah, colleagues, thank you very much. And Michael, thanks for the presentation. Before I go into the ICA thing, I just wanted to perhaps extend on something that Michael would have mentioned. One of the things with when he was making the comparison between, or the statements between synthetic fertilizers and also vermicompost, and also testing your vermicompost, I think one of the key issues that we want to underline is that while you will not see, in terms of nutrient content, while it will not be comparable to the synthetic fertilizers, in your testing and also your marketing, the benefit or the value of the vermicomposting is not based solely on its nutrient content, right? So that's number one. It really is based upon, and even these in my mind are more important, it is really based upon one nutrient component. Yes, it is there. It is based upon the chemical composition in terms of the humic acids and the other types of acids, other microorganisms as well, all of which affects the plant beyond just the issue of the nutrients that is there, meaning that they bring, for example, a stimulant. They stimulate the plant systems for enhanced growth and also enhance immune response as well, in terms of making them more immune to some of the pathogens. In addition to that, in some medical plants, it has been shown to increase the production of the compounds that have medical uses in the plants. So again, if you're marketing if you are considering vermicompost, it is not just a straight comparison with just synthetic fertilizers and a nutrient argument. It goes beyond that in terms of its totality for soil health and also plant health. So I wanted to make that very clear. The other issue with that is that we have seen in some of the vermicomposting systems, we have seen the ability of these worms to actually address some of the hazards in composting in terms of the issue of possibly E. coli or other human pathogen. We have seen that going through that route tends to limit the production or the existence of these things at levels that are a serious concern. So there is that aspect. It's not to say that, and this is what I wanted to say with the vermicompost, just like with the compost, none of these things should be envisioned as a total substitute for balanced nutrient management plan. They do have a role to play, and they play very well with other aspects of management. So it's not just a romantic story that just do this and everything will be all right. It has to come in terms of other principles, etc. So I just wanted to push that one aside for the while. Going forward in terms of, and Craig, I like the questions that you've asked, and Micah has been very humble in terms of perhaps not sharing with you some of the roles that he has done. Ika, through Micah and Mario Lewis, was a consultant. On the behalf of CARICOM, we would have undertaken develop a protocol, a standard, the composting standard, and Micah would have been instrumental in actually doing that. The idea is that we've heard the call for that kind of technology, that kind of response and regulations and CARICOM and regionality. And ICA has been doing work even before that in that area, and we will continue doing work through our partners, both public and private. And so the thing is that any opportunity that we see to partner with private and public institutions, as well as through CARICOM and individuals, we will continue doing that, working through either projects and also some of the NGOs. Some of our projects that are coming up, that are presently in the pipeline, they have elements of that we are hoping would be funded so that we could have the impact, that regional impact and connectivity that you probably referring to. Outside of that, obviously, there is much that could be done by individuals on a private basis to carry that forward. So the take-home message is just keep on looking our way, looking away the way of our partners as well, And we definitely will be having or continuing our support of these kind of technologies and practices. Over.
Thanks very much, Chani. Thanks, Michael, and thank you very much for your comments and your questions. I saw you had a lot of questions in the chat, Craig. And Craig is very interested in collaborating and pushing some of those initiatives forward. He would have shared his email in the chat. You could go ahead and probably share your email again, as a lot of questions came in, Craig. So please feel free to send an email directly to Craig. I saw a lot of other persons were quite interested. So please, that's what the CCRAF is. They bring persons together, and then, you take that leap, work together to build those initiatives further. And, ICA, the CCRAF, we are there to also provide continuous support where we're able to. I will take a question in the chat, and then we will take Ronelson. In terms of, do worms work in a community manner, and what is the best container you would propose in terms of starting the worms, in terms of size and so on, and probably material?
All right. I just want to make sure they were asking, starting from the standpoint of our community group.
Well, it's two questions I gave. Two questions. So do worms work in a community manner in terms of, I guess that's in terms of their behavior? And the second question, what is the best container one could start with? Because the person used a 10-liter plastic and they unfortunately lost all the worms.
Okay. All right. So I would have the variables I mentioned earlier as far as controlling the decomposition process. I would, they seem simple, but I can tell you, if you pay attention to them, that will determine your success or your failure at the practice, right? So we must first appreciate what influences the waste breakdown. As far as the earthworm behavior is concerned, they can operate in mixed cultures. There will naturally be competition among the species for occupying the space for food. So that is something you would have to keep in mind. The nightcrawlers, they are the largest of the three commonly used vermicomposting species. And just by so doing, they have a higher rate of consumption, a higher rate of waste conversion, right? So you have to keep that in mind if you're looking at mixing cultures. Besides that, pure cultures, they get along quite well. The size of your container, I mean, if you have something as small as a soup bowl, you could make vermicompost in it. What you really want to do is just have control over water and the amount of food you're giving them. But if you're really looking to get into it, I would suggest you get a container that is more broad than tall, all right? That will make it easier for them to exist, operate without, being in that sort of deep system where something like as simple as moisture, would start building up at the base of the system and it becomes anaerobic. So I hope that, would answer your question. But as far as the dimension is concerned, I would say if you go in with maybe a 5-gallon bucket, for example, just cut it lengthways. You have 2 worm farms right there, you could start off with a pretty small amount if it is you just want to try it out. If you get 10, you get 50 worms, that is sufficient to start culturing in a system like that, right? Maintain your high level of carbon relative to your green, more nitrogenous type material, and that is a good start. But most of all, I would say go more wide than deep as far as your dimension is concerned.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that, Mike. Of course, further information, you all could reach out to Micah for more details on those more specific information. Ronelson, you could go ahead. I'll ask you to unmute. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nakelia. Thank you, Mr. Martin, for putting all of this together and giving us such a wonderful presentation. Before starting, I would like to say thank you to my students from the State University of Haiti who are here with us today. And I would like to ask this question to Mr. Martin about the fact of, in one of your slides, the slide talking about the food for the worm, you mentioned that it would be better to avoid dairy protein. I would like to know why.
Avoid dairy protein, you said?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So
And, I do have one question for Nakelia as well. We would like to know how to be part of the CCRAF CCRAF conferences, and if you could have a mission in Haiti, mainly at the State University of Haiti, if we can work together, I think that would be great.
Okay, great. Yes, Ronelson, what you could do, just send me an email and we could probably organize a discussion. We do have an ICA office in Haiti. And so just send me an email to the CCRAF email and we can have a discussion and probably have a discussion with the ICA office in Haiti to see how we can facilitate some of that support. Okay? So it's CCRAF@iica.int. So just send me an email and we could organize that. Over to you, Michael.
right. So thank you for your question. What you'll find with these high protein substrates, whether it is meat or dairy and so on, they would, when you add them to the system, that's essentially when they would start decomposing, right? Now, while it is breaking down, it will attract flies and other types of organisms that would come into the system and start competing with the worms. It may also attract things like rats to your system, right? As they break down, the system could become rancid, depending on the amount of whether it's dairy, whether it's milk, or this type of stuff that you would add to your system. So you really do not want to create conditions that would want to cause the worms to migrate out of the system. If there's things for some reason you add them to a hot compost pile, the approach would be typically that you'd want to bury it inside it, that it doesn't attract or create any odors that it would naturally do to attract other organisms to come into the compost pile and therefore creating a nuisance, for the environment for which you are doing the composting. So ideally for the worms where it remains cold and it may not be that deep to try and bury these materials. That is why you really want to leave out some of these cooked waste, because black soldier flies, ants, all of these things will quickly inhabit the pile, and now you have a problem as far as competition is concerned, or you may create an issue where the environment becomes unbearable for the worms, maybe for your neighbors and for you yourself, right? So it's preferable that you leave out some of these cooked stuff from there. You see, with the hot compost, you have the heat that could sort of deter some organisms from getting in, but with the worms, that is not necessarily the case. So it's just a situation where you really want to avoid creating an unnecessary situation in your worm bed.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. So we'll take 2 questions in the chat and then we'll take Peter. So how often do you turn up the heap? And second question, how do you tell visually the different species of worms? I know you may not be able to go in all the details, but if there is any documentation you can share, I can also send that in the follow-up email.
Right. So one of the benefits of the worms in the vermicompost system is that they would naturally aerate it, right, through their activity, that tunneling and moving around. What you will find is that as they break down the material, right, the particles inside there, they tend to become more consistent in size, and it will naturally pack on itself. So you'll find like the lower regions of the worm bin, right, could start to be becoming anaerobic. So you would have to assist them in that regard by aerating the system. At least every 2 weeks is fine, by just gently combing through the worm bin, the bedding material, whether you're doing it by hand or you maybe have a small dull object. You could sort of just gently comb through the system to reduce that natural compaction.
Okay. Thank you for that, Micah. So we will take Peter now. Peter, you could go ahead and unmute. I've sent you the... Oh, sorry. Go ahead again.
There we go. You can hear me?
Yes, I could hear you
Okay,
clearly.
good. My question is to Micah. A number of years ago, I've been doing research on vermiculture for quite a while. And I came across an article out of Cuba on using worms for protein replacement for chickens. And it was saying that the Acina fotida was not quite good enough, was not good for that because of some chemical response, something in their body that was not good for protein replacement with chickens. The chickens basically didn't like it. And I was wondering if that is good information, bad information, whatever. My aim is using vermiculture, vermicompost as a part of my permaculture plan. So I want worms that not only I can use to produce nutrient base for my crops, but also something that I can use to replace proteins for my chickens. That's the question.
Okay,
Hello?
thank you for your question. Yeah, I heard you, right?
Oh, you can hear me, okay. Yeah.
So that's a very valid point you raised there. And you will find that trait with the red wiggler, the Acina fetida, and you'll find that as well with the Perionyx excavatus or the India blue. And you will observe it simply by, if you were to take one of these worms and you keep it in your hand for a period of time, the more the discomfort grows, it will start secreting a sort of yellow substance from its body, kind of sticky. Some researchers have described it as being of a sort of garlic flavor or having that type of compound in it, which basically is their way of controlling other organisms trying to eat them, right, or restricting them. And yes, that in itself could make it less tasteful for livestock. The African nightcrawler, from my personal experience with it and even with the research, that is not the case with it. So it means that that is a feature or a trait that you will not find across all earthworm species. Some just have that as a defense mechanism. The additional advantage with the African nightcrawler, I like to call it the broiler chicken type worm of the worm industry. It's very large. They get quite big, sometimes about 10 inches long once they are well grown. And so as far as a meatworm, it's the type of worm that you'd really want to culture to give you that sort of biomass that you could use as a source of protein or any other purpose for which you could design.
Okay, thanks for the question, and thanks, Michael. So we will take you, Tamika. I'm just going to ask you to unmute your mic so you could go ahead. Okay, you could go ahead, Tamika. You could hear us? I could not hear you, Tamika. Could you hear us? Try again? Okay. Well, in that case, hold on. Go ahead, Tamika. Verify if your mic is connected in the Zoom, and we will come back to you, Tamika. So we'll take Adit Persad now, and Tamika will come back to you, okay? Just raise your hand again. Adit Persad, you're with us? Okay, we lost Adit for now as well. So we'll take some more questions from the chat. Someone wants to know, I'm gonna take two. So someone wants to know what is the lifespan of the worms, and also I know you may have touched on it, but for persons who may have missed it, do you need to provide drainage?
Thank you. So the worms under control conditions where you minimize predators and so affecting them. The research has shown that between 3 to 5 years the worms will exist in the system. All right. Where leachate is concerned, what I teach is a zero leachate system, so that you could retain all your nutrients in your worm castings, your compost, right? So it is important, therefore, if we go back to the factors that influence the decomposition, once you have that excess liquid leaching out of your system, it could be a sign that your system is waterlogged. And that is something you need to adjust, right? Because you would have an issue with oxygen. Things could start becoming anaerobic inside there, and you may be encouraging pathogens that you do not want in your compost. Persons, that's a practice you might see online where sometimes persons basically drench their worm farm and try to collect what they call worm tea from the system. I really discourage that. Please bear in mind, when you found the worms, you may have found them in a nice, damp environment, oxygen rich, and they are enjoying life. You shouldn't really want to create, an extreme environment for them that would make them want to escape or die in a system. So there's no need for, perforations or these type of holes in the system. You could get good quality worm castings by just maintaining damp conditions.
Thanks, Michael. So we have just a few more questions to take before we wrap up. So how do you minimize eggs or hatchling loss when utilizing the vermicompost for planting or sale, especially if you are trying to expand on the worm population?
All right, thank you for your question again. So I will give you a brief explanation with that. So the question is directly related to the life cycle of the worm. So please bear in mind that, after about 10 to 12 weeks, a lot of your eggs that would have been deposited, they would be hatching, but you would also keep feeding, so you would be getting fresh eggs in the system. So there must be some type of gradient that you're going to have to observe as you manage the system. So initially, when you started feeding the worms, everything inside it looks raw, bulky, By the time you get to that point, you would notice majority of the bin find material in the system. That is an indicator that it is time to harvest, right? What you want to do is start feeding your system, your worm bin, on one side to encourage your worms to gravitate to remain in one area of the bin. That will ensure that no new egg deposits would occur in the area where you have mainly castings remaining, right? And therefore, you are sort of engaging in a sort of transitioning where you're preparing to harvest castings and you are simultaneously restarting the system. You would start moving the castings now to one side of the bin and you start to feed the other side of the bin fresh food. Whatever eggs are remaining in the casting material, so I could put it like this. If it is you want to harvest maybe by week 13, you could start that process somewhere maybe about week 9 in your production process. The eggs would normally take 2 weeks for most species, particularly for the nightcrawler. So if you give yourself that sort of time frame, what will happen is that whatever eggs are remaining in the casting material, they will hatch. They will migrate to the fresh food. And by the time you come around to extract the castings from the bin, 9 out of 10 of your eggs would have been hatched successfully. They would have moved over. Your population would have grown at least 2 to 3 times more by then. And your loss on eggs and juveniles, you would have significantly reduced that. And I would say at minimal effort. By the time you're ready to harvest, most of the worms would have left the casting material. There's nothing more nutritious there for them to really enjoy. And so you could easily extract the castings. It would be a bit more dry and the system will continue once you would have removed that. And you can occupy the remaining area with fresh food. So that's one simple way of protecting your population while you are extracting castings from the system.
Okay, excellent. So some persons from Bahamas are asking if anybody in Bahamas does the vermicomposting. So if anybody from Bahamas or knows, please let us know so we can share that information with the persons. So we got the question in the chat from, hold on one second, from Tamika. So she's speaking in terms of collection and use of the compost. She says it's direct use in container gardening to be easily collected, but what about direct soil use? Is it that the compost is sifted and worms removed before use of the compost to the soil, or do you apply the compost to the soil and they remain in the soil system and can be collected thereafter? So it's basically, yeah, go ahead, Micah.
Right, so thank you. You would want to sieve the castings at the end of that process, preferably when it dries out a bit so that it will be able to be screened easier. The finest mesh you could get anywhere, like let's say about 2 to 3 millimeters. Out there, that might be like a 1/8 wire mesh. You could build your screen and you would sift out the degraded material by the worms, which would be that fine black sandy material from the unprocessed material. What would remain would typically be stuff you could recognize, maybe bits of paper, food waste, whatever it is, that can go back in your system. That is the material that you will use in your soil. From my experience of doing it, I have not had the need for using the synthetic fertilizers. But again, it always goes back to why you are doing it. If you're just for home use, you could rely on it as your fertilizer along with other organic sources, to supplement your nutrient needs, right? So yeah, you could add it to your soil, make your own soil mix, your media, and so on. And if you add the worms to your soil, I think that might have been one of the questions that was asked. Yes, you can, particularly the night crawlers, they work well, in terms of aerating the upper horizon of the soil. So if you have them in your garden pots, they will help to loosen up the soil for you. For them to stick around, however, you would have to ensure that, you add some bit of organic material, maybe somebody non-marketable stuff, or the stuff that you would not really consume. You may have to bury some of that inside it just for them to stick around, because once they would have exhausted what was in the soil, they will naturally migrate out to some other container also. So you have to keep feeding the soil in that sense.
Great, very good. So we have a company, it's a castor oil production company that also grows their own beans. And so they're interested in expanding into vermicompost, since the waste can be turned into fertilizer called castor meal. So what they want to know, can the waste be fed to the worms? And if so, are there worm species that can handle toxic plant materials better than others?
All right, thank you for your question. Now, we know that castor seed, the oil in particular, is very potent. Is not something that I'm familiar with in terms of the worms and the interactions with it, but there's a possibility that it could, kill the worms. We have to go ahead with that sort of thinking, right? My experience with dealing with waste, like neem, for example, we know neem, like, it's toxic and will kill most organisms. If you compost it, the worm response to it will improve, right? So the microbes will contribute to breaking down some of these compounds inside there. So rather than feeding the material directly to the worms, just to put it simple, you could take it through a composting process, and that could improve it. I've seen reports out there, they mention like citrus and pineapple can, the worms would respond to some of these things negatively, and I've tried adding some of these materials to the system, and the response has not been favorable. But just composting it, putting it in our composting system, the worms did not necessarily differentiate anymore as far as the quality of the material is concerned, and they ate it. So I think with it has to be a research-based approach if it is you want to feed them an unusual material, but composting these materials for sure can help improve those responses. And it goes back to, I think, what I was mentioning earlier, just the whole idea of bioactive compounds in food, like in our case, cassava, dasheen, pawpaw, all of these things that might cause some kind of itching or an unfavorable taste, just cooking it, right? Because we cook it, it becomes consumable. You could eat it, right? So the heat, therefore, would have helped to break down or reduce the negative effect of some of these compounds, means that they might be heat sensitive. And therefore, with some of these materials, if you include that component, composting component with some of these organic materials, it can, open up the possibility of using unusual materials in a vermicomposting system.
Okay, thanks, Micah. So Pauline says she has some experience and it will kill the worms. Also, the Cardi Jamaica has that experience. So from that experience, thanks, Pauline, for sharing that experience. So she indicated the castor bean cake will kill the worms, and even after composting it, the castor bean is a bit deadly. Chani, we see your hand up. Go ahead. You could unmute yourself.
Oh, no, I didn't see that they would have answered that, but that is the case from the experience. Because of the type of phytotoxic compound that is there, while it does change the heat a bit, it still remains in a format that is toxic to a lot of, not just worms, but to other microbes and other species as well. So I'm glad that the experience otherwise confirmed that. Over.
Great, thanks. Thanks for that, Pauline. Thanks for that addition there, Chani. So we have just a few more questions left, just about 3 or 4 of them. I'll give you 2 of them, Mike. Can one use cow manure mixed in with part decomposed green materials? And how can we prevent centipedes from entering the compost?
Right, thank you. Yeah, cow manure is something the worms love, right? If you want to mix it with green materials, I'll share with you a simple material that I add sometimes to it, and it works out well in addition to other stuff. The worms love moringa, so if I add some of the leaves there, it improves their response to it. If you add your vegetable scraps, just because of the environment for which the waste, this manure comes from, you have, a wide variety of microbes there that will contribute to the rapid breakdown of some of these organic waste. So yeah, you can make combinations like that to improve the response of the worms to certain types of organic waste, because if you feed them certain materials directly, the response could be low-key, but if you give them something they love, like manure, cattle manure, for example, that can improve the response to some of these organic wastes. Now, if you are finding centipedes, and I would like to add flatworms and so on in manure, that is a source issue. That may not be the case for most places. And what you want to do with that, I would simply suggest just pre-composting. The heat that you would generate from the pre-composting process would get rid of some of these organisms and reduce the need for having to use any type of chemical out there to try and control their presence, because we know that both of these organisms will decimate your vermicompost systems. The centipedes will definitely get rid of your worms. And what you'll find with the flatworms in particular, their mode of reproduction is much more efficient than the earthworms, so they would really just colonize the system quickly and basically kill out all your earthworms inside it. So it's important, based on that question, the type of waste, also the source, where it comes from, right? If you're collecting it from the open field, you're going out there, you're collecting manure cakes and so on from the cattle, is a good source of food for the worms, but it's also an environment that encourages predators, opportunists to look and hopefully find some source of food, which is your worms. So if you do find yourself going out there and collecting these organic materials, I would suggest that you take them to, that bit of composting process to reduce that, the possibility of their presence. And that is a low-cost approach and a safe approach to control the presence inside it.
Okay, thanks, Micah. I think the person may have missed it, but I wanted to know, what is the ideal space needed to start vermicompost? I know we touched on it, so I think that person joined in late. So what is the ideal space? And the second question, you mentioned flower in Cuba. What type of flower?
Right. So the Cuba situation, the same book I mentioned there, you'll find it inside there. They talk about processing the worms into a flour. That would make it much easier to mix with other materials, substrates that they would use to feed the animals, right? It's much easier than trying to mix the live worms into the food, because, the worms would start to break down there and it would not be favorable or something that the livestock would really like. So if you dry it and turn it into a flour, then it's easy to mix with maybe with your corn or whatever grain that you're using to feed them. So that's where it came about, earthworm flour, to put it so to speak. The container, the environment, what you really want, as I mentioned earlier, is to mimic the soil conditions. So your worm bin should not be exposed to direct sunlight. It should not be exposed to the rain, where it could become waterlogged, right? For you, the user, it must be at a comfortable height or level for you to be able to operate in it. And the moisture, you just have to have full control over what is going on inside there. If you don't, then you need to adjust that, right? That's the key thing about your design. The location, you keep it under a cool environment where you have good airflow, right? That is sufficient, so that the sun would not be making direct contact with the system nor the rain. And I think it should be fine. As far as the dimension is concerned, some of the reports out there, it would be like a pound of worms to a square foot. I would really just want you to take it from a more practical standpoint, that if it is, let's say, you're able to get 100 worms outside there, maybe something like a 5-gallon bucket cut lengthwise would be a good start, right? You don't want to spread that over a large container, right? Where the amount of waste material, food material you have to put in that container far outweighs it's way beyond that the amount of worms that you would need to add to the system. So you start off small, the worms will be close, you'll have easy breeding, and so as your numbers grow, you can expand the system. If you want to go that specific in terms of pound per square foot area, then the amount of worms you're looking for, you may not necessarily find it, right? So there has to be some bit of flexibility there in terms of starting. But even if you find 2 worms, it's a good start. I would say start it off in a small container so that they don't have to be spending most of their life looking for one another inside it.
Okay, excellent. So we'll take the last 2 questions. So is how deep should the compost bin be? And what local species is E and P? I'm guessing that is from your presentation. If you're not sure, that was from Cecile Johnson. I don't know if Cecile, you're on, that you want to expound on that question. But the first question was, what is the maximum depth you should use? Recommended depth.
Right. Comfortably, you can go at about 16 inches, right? And you would want a spread there of maybe, so if that's the depth of the bin, the base should be giving you somewhere maybe around 20, 24 inches by maybe another 30. So again, you have a wider base area than the depth of the bin.
Okay, great, thanks. Cecile
That
Johnson,
depth would work for a bucket, but
mm-hmm.
the bucket is still narrow, so you could just have a situation where you have a lot of moisture and so building up below there.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
great. Do you want to just raise your hand so I could unmute you, Cecile, so you could ask the question? A, B, C, 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 C. Okay, I could see you. So I'm asking you to unmute. You could go ahead, Cecile.
No, I said he has answered. I'm really appreciative of what he's talking about, because for us as small farmers and with the fertilizer potential disruption, this is a really good time for him to be talking about this. So I just want to say thank you for the information that we've received, and I will look at the book.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Cecile, and all the best with your farming enterprise. Thank you for joining us. Yes, I have one very last question, Mike, and that goes to scale. From your experience and how you go ahead doing it, how can you scale material production into larger quantities for commercial sales or bagged product for residential or smaller scale product development?
All right. So if you are looking to, you are particularly interested in, vermicompost production, and you would like to scale up, it's just important you understand the market that you are trying to serve, right? What you want to do is sort of streamline your process, because if you really looking to do scale, your production process must be something that it comes across easy. So your waste sources, they must be sort of reliable, accessible. Your formula, your recipe for your production must also be more or less standard or almost narrow, that there's little variation. So it shouldn't be a point where, these 2 weeks you get vegetable waste, and for the next few months, you're not too sure where you're getting it. That will affect your quality. So you would need to determine what are your base materials, right? All that is in preparation for you going to put some type of product out there, and you could stand by the quality, right? It should not vary too much. Once you get that under control, then the way you prepare that waste to feed it to the worms, I encourage composting, pre-composting. That can help you significantly. If you have, another way of feeding it directly and it works, you realize the composting, vermicomposting is not hard and fast. You just have to maintain the principles. And once you can get that in terms of your production out of the way, then it really reaches to the point now, who are you going to serve? If it's homeowners, maybe in a particular development or in a particular municipal area, you figure that out, and you sort of do a little determination on maybe how much of that market you feel you could feed or serve, and how much you think you could produce. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I would really like to say, refine your production process first, right? While you are doing your investigation of the market, right? Because if it is, the demand says that, well, we need 500 pounds, 600 pounds of worm castings per week, then how much waste does that translate to? And therefore, where can I get this waste consistently? That's important.
Okay, excellent. So that brings us to the end of the questions. We don't have any more questions at the time. So we want to thank all of you for joining us. So Mike, I'll allow you 1 minute to just say one of the key things, within the vermicomposting that you would like the participants to really be aware of.
Okay, thank you. Again, I just want to extend my thanks to you and the team, Chani, all of you all. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share. What I would really like to share with the listeners is that become familiar with the topic, understand the worm, its life cycle, its requirements, food requirements and so on. Once you get that out of the way, you should be able to move forward comfortably. Persons tend to fail, and sometimes they fail just as a result of, I would say, lack of knowledge, lack of understanding of what they're getting into. So I think that would be my simple comment to you. Just become familiar with the principles associated with the vermicomposting and decomposition.
Okay, excellent. Micah, thank you so much. I don't know how else to say thank you to you and our presenters. They are facilitating these very informative, very practical sessions for free. And we're also very happy to see that you, the participants, this information is also very useful to you and it's practical that you could use. Of course, please remember you could reach out to us at the CCRAF email. You could go to our website, ccraf.iica.int. And so we have our part 3, our final session in the series coming up next week with Mrs. Pauline Smith in Jamaica. And we will be looking at starting a small mushroom enterprise. And so for those of you with interest there, we'll be hosting that session next week, Wednesday, the 25th. I have placed the information in terms of the registration in the chat. I'm placing it again. And so I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Apologies again that we have to keep you all muted for the security purposes. But once I close off the recording, I will allow the mics to be open so we can say a little bye to each other from across the region, hear the different accents and see some of the lovely faces as well. As I mentioned, we will be in Jamaica month-end, the 30th. So it would be nice if we're able to, within that short space of time, able to meet some of you. We live in Jamaica on the 1st of April. So if we're able to meet any of you, we have Pauline, our presenter, next week from Jamaica. So hopefully we could meet on the ground. So with that, everyone, thank you. The recording will be shared. It will be shared. It will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So please go to our YouTube channel. You could go to our website where you can easily access all of the information and the various social media sites. So with that, thank you, everyone. Let me just stop the recording now and then I will unmute.